Have you ever felt the weight of expectations that the world projects onto you, simply because of who you are? Grace Williams knew what it meant to carry a name that represented more than just an identity. It represented a heritage, a story of struggle and dignity. But on that sultry summer afternoon in Atlanta, while trying to make a simple purchase, Grace found herself at the center of a storm of prejudice, all because of unfair suspicions and sidelong glances. How will she face public shame when all she wanted was a moment of peace? When her past and present collide, Grace will be forced to confront buried secrets and the weight of a legacy she never chose but has always defined her. Subscribe to the channel to follow this exciting story and leave your comment below. Your opinions are important to us. The hot, thick summer air seemed to suffocate the city of Atlanta, muffling the sounds and making time drag by lazily. Grace Williams, with her calm posture and safe steps, entered the local shopping mall, feeling the coolness of the air conditioning caressing her skin. It was a brief relief from the heat outside, but she knew that her purpose here was simple and objective: to find a dress for the family dinner that would take place at the weekend. Coming from a traditional, simple but highly respected family in the local African-American community, Grace carried with her the dignity of a name that meant more than just lineage. It was a mark of respect and expectations, something she never took lightly. Although she preferred discretion, Grace knew that wherever she went, she was recognized, if only by a subtle glance or a nod. As she walked through the mall's corridors, the illuminated windows of designer stores reflected her image, but Grace didn't pay much attention. She was focused on her mission, finding the perfect dress that honored the occasion and the family she represented. As she entered the designer clothing store, the elegant atmosphere enveloped her. Soft fabrics, sophisticated colors, and light ambient music created an inviting atmosphere. However, there was something more, something that immediately made her feel out of place. The store's security guard, a burly man with an expressionless face, gave her a look that Grace couldn't ignore. It was a look she knew all too well, a look she had faced countless times over the years. It was the look of unfounded suspicion, of silent distrust, something that made her feel instantly uncomfortable, as if she didn't belong there. Grace tried to focus on the dresses, running her fingers through the fabric, trying to find something she liked. But the security guard's presence seemed to grow with each passing moment, like a slowly approaching shadow, until she could no longer ignore it. He was there, always in sight, watching her with an intensity that made her skin tingle. Taking a deep breath, Grace tried to shake off the discomfort. "I'm just buying a dress," she thought, trying to convince herself that there was no reason to worry. She was a respectable woman, a citizen who paid her taxes, someone who had never given cause for distrust. But the world often didn't see that. And that afternoon, it seemed like the world refused to see her for who she really was. Finally, she found a dress that felt perfect, simple, elegant, with a touch of sophistication that reflected who she was. With him in her arms, Grace headed to the dressing room. But before she could enter, the security guard appeared in her path, blocking her path. "Excuse me," he said, his voice low but charged with authority. "Can I see your bag?" The request took her by surprise. "My bag?" Grace repeated, trying to understand the situation. "Why?" "We've received some complaints from customers about suspicious behavior," he replied, without looking away. "We just need to make sure everything is in order." Humiliation hit her like a cold wave. The security guard's words, although carefully neutral, carried an implicit accusation. Grace felt her legs tremble slightly, but she maintained her posture. With slow, controlled movements, she handed over the bag, knowing that any resistance would be futile and perhaps dangerous. As the security guard searched her bag, Grace felt the eyes of the other customers on her. Each second seemed to drag by, stretching into a thread of shame and indignation. When she was finally finished, the security guard returned her bag, but the peace she had felt when she entered the store was gone. "You can continue," he said, as if he had done her a great favor. Grace tried to maintain her dignity as she walked to the register, but the feeling of being judged, watched, didn't leave her. As she paid for the dress, her hands still shaking, she could barely maintain her composure. All he wanted was to get out of there as quickly as possible. But Destiny had other plans. As soon as Grace left the store, two police officers quickly approached, intercepting her path. "Ma'am, we need you to come with us," one of them said, the tone of voice making it clear that there was no room for discussion. Grace looked around, realizing everyone in the mall was watching. The humiliation turned into a suffocating lump in his throat. "But I didn't do anything," she tried to argue, but the police were already guiding her, without giving her time to explain. The dignity that Grace had always cherished seemed to crumble before her eyes, and the weight of public judgment fell on her like an avalanche. As she was led through the mall's hallways, with looks of curiosity and condemnation following her every step, Grace couldn't understand how a simple purchase had turned into a nightmare of shame and distrust. And at that moment, as they led her out, a question echoed in her mind. Why was this happening? And who, or what, was behind this terrible mess? The sound of footsteps echoed through the mall corridors, each movement accompanied by the attentive gazes of strangers. Grace felt the weight of each pair of eyes that turned to her, silently judging her. The police officers led her firmly, their strong hands holding her arms, as if they feared she would run away at any moment. With each step, humiliation grew inside her, a flame that burned away her dignity, until there were only ashes left of a pride she had always carried so carefully. Grace couldn't understand how she had gotten to that point. She was a respectable woman, a dedicated professional, and a daughter who honored her family. Yet here she was, being treated like a criminal in front of dozens of strangers who whispered among themselves, not knowing who she really was. The respect his family had always had in the community seemed to evaporate before his eyes, replaced by merciless and undeserved judgment. As they walked through the mall, Grace held her head high, despite the tremors inside her. She knew that any display of weakness would be a victory for those who looked down on her, but maintaining this posture required every ounce of his inner strength. All she wanted was to disappear, to be swallowed by the ground, anything that would free her from the crushing shame that suffocated her. The police took her outside the mall, where a police car was waiting for her. The hot Atlanta air felt even more suffocating as she was placed in the back seat, the sound of the door closing sounding like a sentence. During the entire journey to the police station, Grace tried to organize her thoughts, find a way to explain the absurd situation in which she found herself. But no matter how hard he tried, the same question echoed in his mind. Why me? What did I do to deserve this? Upon arriving at the police station, Grace was led down a narrow, dark corridor where the air seemed heavier, charged with suspicion and distrust. She was taken to a small interrogation room, its walls bare and cold, offering her little comfort. One of the police officers, a man with a hard and tired expression, sat opposite him, while the other remained standing, crossing his arms, as if waiting for a confession. "So, Grace Williams, what were you doing at the store today?" asked the seated police officer, his voice thick with suspicion. "I was just shopping for a dress," Grace replied, trying to keep her voice steady despite the lump forming in her throat. "It was for a family event at the weekend." The officer raised an eyebrow, as if skeptical of the simplicity of his answer. "And why did the store security guard feel you were acting suspiciously?" Grace blinked, surprised by the question. "I don't know. I was just looking at the clothes, trying to decide which ones to buy." The other officer, who until then had been silent, stepped forward, his voice deep and cold. "Are you sure there's nothing else you'd like to tell us? No reason why anyone would think you were doing anything wrong?" Grace felt a chill run down her spine. There was something in his tone that made her uncomfortable, as if he knew something she didn't. "No, I didn't do anything wrong," she replied, now with a hint of desperation in her voice. "Please, I just want to understand what's going on." The officers looked at each other, as if sharing a silent secret. Grace's discomfort grew by the second, uncertainty eating away at her defenses. She knew there was something more behind those questions, something that made her feel like she was being judged for reasons beyond what she could understand. "Mrs. Williams," the seated officer began, leaning forward, "perhaps you'd better start telling us the truth. Who knows? This might make things easier for you." Those words hit her like a blow. The truth? What truth were they implying? Grace felt the ground open beneath her feet, an abyss of fear and confusion threatening to swallow her. She wanted to scream, wanted to tell them they were making a mistake, that she was a good person, a woman who had always done what was right. But the words stuck in his throat, choked by the feeling that something much bigger was at stake. What Grace couldn't understand was why her life had suddenly turned upside down. The distrust in the eyes of the police, the judgment in the looks of people at the mall, everything seemed to conspire to make her doubt herself. And as the hours dragged by in that small interrogation room, suspicion began to turn into something darker inside his heart, a doubt about what was really happening and why he was being targeted with such an absurd accusation. And in that moment, Grace knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The small interrogation room at the police station seemed to shrink with each passing minute. The walls, already closed and without windows, seemed to get closer, making the environment claustrophobic. Grace felt the air heavy, charged with the accumulated tension of the last few hours. Anxiety was building inside her, fueled by a silent, persistent fear that she fought to keep under control. The police officer in front of her, the same one who had looked at her suspiciously from the beginning, was now examining her documents with a serious expression. He had that attentive look of someone used to finding something out of the ordinary, and the way his eyes narrowed as he read the papers increased Grace's apprehension. "Grace Williams," he murmured, as if testing the sound of the name, trying to find a connection that didn't yet make sense to him. He turned a page, his eyes darting over the lines of text. "You seem like a pretty ordinary woman, but something here doesn't add up." Grace swallowed hard, trying to maintain her composure. She knew there were parts of her life that could never be revealed, secrets she had buried deep inside, believing she would never have to face them again. But now, under the penetrating gaze of that police officer, she felt exposed, as if those secrets were on the verge of being unearthed. "What did you do before you came to Atlanta?" he asked, without taking his eyes off the documents. The question seemed casual, but Grace knew there was more to it. What was he trying to find out? "I lived in another city," Grace replied, keeping her voice controlled. "But I prefer not to talk too much about my past." The officer finally looked up, meeting her eyes. "Why not? Is there something you're hiding, Grace?" The question hung in the air, loaded with suspicion. Grace felt her heart race, but tried not to show it. "Everyone has things from the past they'd rather leave behind," she said, carefully choosing her words. "My past is just that, past." The officer watched her for a moment, as if weighing every word. He then got up and left the room without saying anything else, leaving Grace alone with her turbulent thoughts. The silence that followed was almost unbearable. She could hear the distant sound of traffic outside, a stark contrast to the whirlwind of emotions simmering inside her. After a few minutes that seemed like an eternity, the police officer returned, now accompanied by a colleague. They exchanged a look before sitting back down in front of Grace. The second police officer, younger and with a serious face, placed a file on the table. "We found some things about you, Grace," the young man began, his voice firm but not hostile. "Things that weren't as visible in their ordinary records." Grace felt a shiver run down her spine. What he feared was materializing before his eyes. The secrets she had kept for so many years were finally coming to light, and there was no longer any way to escape. "Could you explain to us why your name is linked to a series of events in a city where you claim to have never lived?" the young officer asked, pushing the file toward Grace. The document was open to a page that contained a photo of her, much younger, and the name of a city she knew very well, but had not visited in many years. She stared at the photo, memories flooding her mind like a relentless tide. They were memories that she had kept locked away, but that were now forcing themselves out, threatening to destroy the new life she had built with so much effort. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everything that was to come. "I lived there for a while," Grace admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I left a long time ago. I tried to start over." The police officers exchanged glances again, as if trying to comprehend the story unfolding before them. Why did you leave, Grace? And why are there no clear records of what you did during that time? Grace closed her eyes for a brief moment, trying to gather her strength. She knew she was on the verge of revealing something that would change everything. There are things I didn't want discovered. Things I did, choices I made, that changed my life forever. But I'm not the person you seem to think I am. The silence that followed was piercing, full of tension and uncertainty. Grace knew there was no turning back. The secrets she had hidden for so long were beginning to emerge, and with them, the truths that could shake the assumptions of the cops and everyone around her. The room seemed to pulse with a charged energy, as if the walls themselves were aware of the magnitude of what was happening. Grace looked at the officers, knowing that what came next would change everything. The question was she ready to face the consequences of her revelations? The silence in the interrogation room seemed to have a weight of its own, as if the unspoken words and forcefully kept secrets had turned the air into something thick and difficult to breathe. Grace felt the weight of everything that was to come, the words hanging on her lips, waiting to be released. She knew there was no more running away. The truth, as painful as it was, needed to be revealed. And deep down, she knew it was time. The younger police officer who had opened the file watched her with a mixture of curiosity and expectation. He clearly hadn't expected this seemingly ordinary woman to be at the center of something so complex. The older police officer, with his deep wrinkles and tired eyes, seemed to have seen many lives unfold in rooms like that. But at that moment, he knew he was about to hear something different. "There's a lot more to this story than you realize," Grace began, her voice soft but charged with emotion. She could feel the tremor in her hands, but she kept them steady on the table. "I didn't go to the mall just to buy a dress. I was there because of a promise I made many years ago to someone who meant everything to me." The officer's eyes narrowed, curiosity growing. "And what does this promise have to do with?" asked the younger man, his voice now softer, as if he recognized the seriousness of what he was about to hear. Grace took a deep breath, feeling the wave of emotions that always invaded her when she thought about that period in her life. "It was for Nathan," she finally said, almost as if she was admitting it to herself. "He was the great love of my life." The police officers exchanged glances. The name Nathan seemed to float in the air, filled with memories that only Grace could understand. "He was someone very special to me," she continued, her voice now firmer, as if finding the courage to talk about him strengthened her in some way. "We were young, in love, and we had plans for the future. But fate had other plans." She paused, closing her eyes for a brief moment, as if reliving those days. When she opened her eyes again, they were bright with the tears she was fighting to hold back. "Nathan and I promised that we would always be there for each other no matter what. And when things got tough, when he was about to leave, he asked me one thing, that I keep the memory of our love, somehow." Grace looked down at her hands, remembering how Nathan held her hand so tenderly, even in the darkest moments. "He gave me a ring, a small token of what we shared, and I promised I would keep it with me, always. But after he was gone, I couldn't. I kept it in a place where I knew no one would find it, in a pocket of a dress I never wore." The officers remained silent, absorbing the story that was unfolding before them. "I was at the mall that day because I heard that dress, the same dress I never had the courage to wear, was back in the store. I needed that ring. I needed to honor my promise to Nathan." The room was silent for a few moments, only the sound of Grace's breathing and the police officers filling the space. "But why was all this hidden for so long?" the older officer asked, his voice now full of understanding and empathy. Grace looked at him, her tears finally escaping. "Because over the years the pain became unbearable. Every time I thought about him, every time I remembered the ring, it was like reliving his loss all over again. So I buried it, along with all the feelings that came with it. And when I moved to Atlanta, I vowed to start over, without the ghosts of the past haunting me." The police officers nodded slowly, as if everything was now starting to make sense. The woman who stood before them was not just someone who had been wrongfully accused. She was someone who carried deep pain, a lost love, and an unfulfilled promise. The weight of all this seemed to fall on the room, making the police officers themselves feel the gravity of the situation. "The ring. Did you find it?" the younger officer asked, almost hesitantly, as if he didn't want to touch something so delicate. Grace shook her head slowly. "No. I was about to ask to see the dress, but before I could, I was approached by security, and everything that happened after prevented me from finding what I was looking for." The police officers remained silent, now realizing that Grace's trip to the mall had nothing to do with what they had imagined. The truth was much more complex, much more human than any assumption they had made. Grace wasn't there to commit a crime. She was there to recover a piece of her heart that had been lost a long time ago. "I think we understand now," the older officer said, his voice gentle but full of weight. "This was never about a dress or anything material. It was about love, loss, and the fight to keep alive the memories that matter most." Grace looked at him, feeling a relief she didn't know she needed. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking. "It was always about that." The silence that followed was full of understanding, a muted recognition of Grace's suffering and the power of her revelations. And as they stood there, in that small space, it felt like the weight of all the years of pain and secrecy was finally beginning to lift, leaving room for something new, maybe even healing. The gentle late afternoon breeze caressed Grace's face as she walked through the streets of Atlanta toward the mall. The heat from the sun that still remained in the sky began to dissipate, giving way to a night that promised to be cool and peaceful. But inside her, a storm of emotions was stirring. What had started as a simple trip to buy a dress had turned into a journey to uncover the secrets she had kept for so long. Now, with a lighter heart, but still filled with a mixture of anxiety and hope, Grace approached the mall again. She had been released from the police station with a strange sense of relief, as if by revealing part of her truth, she had freed a part of herself that had been trapped for years. But he knew his journey wasn't over yet. Entering the mall, Grace was immediately enveloped by the hustle and bustle of people around her, the sound of laughter and conversations echoing through the hallways. But unlike the first time, she didn't feel invisible or watched with suspicion. She felt determined, with a clear purpose in mind. The search for Nathan's ring was not just to fulfill a promise, but to reclaim something deeper, his own identity. When she entered the clothing store again, déjà vu hit her hard. The same elegant atmosphere, the same racks full of sophisticated dresses, the same soft music playing in the background. But this time, Grace was prepared. She knew exactly what she was looking for. The security guard who had earlier confronted her was nowhere in sight. But even if he was, Grace knew nothing could stop her search. With firm steps, she headed to the section where she had found the dress last time. The bright lights illuminated the delicate fabrics, and Grace ran her fingers through the clothes, looking for the one who had hidden the ring so many years ago. As his hands slid along the hangers, his mind began to go back in time. Memories that she had kept under lock and key began to surface, as if each touch of the fabric triggered a long-forgotten memory. She remembered the day she bought the dress for the first time, in a small store in a town where she and Nathan had spent one of the best weekends of their lives. She remembered how Nathan had looked at her as she tried on the dress, his eyes shining with love and admiration. "That's the dress," he had said, smiling with that mixture of confidence and tenderness that always made her feel special. "You look stunning." Grace felt a tear escape as the memory washed over her, but she didn't wipe it away. He let it fall, as a tribute to what had been and what still mattered. Finally, his fingers found the fabric he was looking for. It was the dress, the one that held the secret she had buried along with her emotions. She removed the dress from the hanger carefully, almost reverently. Holding it, Grace felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. The dress felt heavier in her hands than she remembered, as if it were carrying the weight of all the years of unresolved feelings. She knew the ring was still there, hidden in the inside pocket where she had placed it, as a symbol of everything she and Nathan had shared. With the dress in hand, Grace headed to the dressing room. The small cabin was a temporary refuge, a space where she could reconnect with her past without the prying eyes of others. Inside, she took a deep breath and closed her eyes for a moment, smelling the new fabric mixed with the fragrances of the room. It was a familiar smell, one that brought back memories of when she and Nathan were still together, dreaming of the future. With shaking hands, Grace felt for the inside pocket of her dress. And there it was, the little ring Nathan had given her, still as shiny as the day she had received it. Holding it in her palm, Grace felt a wave of emotion so intense that she had to sit down to keep from losing her balance. The ring was simple, but full of meaning, a silver circle that symbolized the eternal love they had promised each other. As he looked at the ring, memories of Nathan and their moments together began to flow like an uncontrolled river. She remembered the nights they spent together, talking about their dreams and hopes, how he made her feel safe and loved, and how everything seemed possible when they were together. But she also remembered the pain of losing him, the emptiness she felt when he was gone, and how she had tried to bury those emotions to move on. Grace realized that no matter how much she tried to escape the past, it was always with her, carried in that little ring. And now, as she held him again, she felt like she was ready to face everything he represented. He knew he needed to make peace with his past in order to move forward. She placed the ring on her finger, the place where it always should have been, and felt a strange sense of completeness. As if, when she put on the ring, she was accepting everything that had happened, both the joys and the sadness, and was finally ready to move on. As she left the dressing room, Grace looked at her reflection in the mirror. He saw a woman who had faced her fears, who had unearthed painful secrets, and who, despite everything, was stronger than ever. The reflection showed a Grace who was no longer defined by her past, but by her courage to face it. Paying for the dress, Grace left the store with a feeling of peace she hadn't felt in years. He knew there was still a lot to be resolved, many questions to be answered, but for the first time, he felt in control of his life. She had regained something she thought she had lost forever, not just Nathan's ring, but a part of herself. And as she walked home, Grace knew the future was full of possibilities. Because now, with the ring on her finger and the weight of secrets finally lifted, she was ready to start again, with a lighter heart and a peaceful mind. The gentle wind of a sunny morning rustled the leaves on the trees as Grace walked towards the mall once again. Now, with Nathan's ring on her finger, she felt more connected to the past than ever, but she also knew there was something more waiting for her, something that needed to be discovered, faced, and finally resolved. The weight of the secrets she had carried for years felt less crushing, but still present, like a shadow that followed her wherever she went. She knew what she was looking for, something she herself had hidden, a letter she chose to forget a long time ago. But now, with the ring serving as a constant reminder of everything she had lived and lost, Grace knew it was time to unearth that last vestige of her past and face the truth she had avoided for so long. As she entered the clothing store, the familiar aroma of fine fabrics and expensive perfumes enveloped her. There was something comforting about that environment, but at the same time, it carried the promise of an inevitable confrontation. Grace walked to the section where she had found the dress the day before, each step resonating with the echo of her own emotions. She knew the letter was there, in the same pocket where she had found the ring, and this time, she was ready to read it. The dress, with its soft color and delicate fabric, seemed to almost call to her. Grace held it carefully, feeling the familiarity of the fabric beneath her fingers. It was like holding on to a part of herself, a part she had tried to bury but now refused to stay hidden. With a deep breath, she slipped her hand into her inner pocket and felt the paper crinkle beneath her fingers. The letter was there, exactly where she had left it. Grace withdrew the letter with shaking hands, her heart pounding in her chest. The paper was a little yellowed with age, but still readable. She unfolded the sheet carefully, as if she were uncovering a piece of her own soul. And then he started reading. The words written in Nathan's firm, elegant handwriting leapt off the pages, bringing back memories so vivid that I could almost hear his soft voice as he read. The letter spoke of love, of shared dreams, but also of choices that had been made in the name of that love. And as she read, Grace realized that this letter was more than just a goodbye. It was a confession. Nathan had written about their love, a love that had been forbidden by the circumstances around them. There were social and cultural barriers that they had never been able to fully overcome, and this had forced them to make difficult decisions, choices that shaped the course of their lives. Nathan mentioned the pain of having to hide the relationship, the constant fear of being discovered, and how this had led them to make sacrifices that at the time seemed necessary. Grace felt tears run down her face as Nathan's words shot through her like arrows. He wrote about his decision to step aside to protect her, as part of an agreement he had made to ensure she could have a safe and dignified life, even if it meant never being together again. And then, at the end of the letter, he expressed his regret for everything they had lost, but also his hope that one day she could find the peace and forgiveness he wanted for her. The letter was a farewell, but also a kind of blessing. Nathan was giving her permission to move forward, to find happiness in any way possible, even if he couldn't be by her side. But Grace knew that in all these years she had never truly left Nathan behind. His memory, his love, were still as alive inside her as on that last day they said goodbye. Closing her eyes for a moment, Grace held the letter to her chest, as if she were holding Nathan once again. He felt a wave of emotions wash over him. Sadness, regret, but also a deep gratitude for everything they had shared. But most of all, he felt an urgent need to reconcile with the past, to make peace with the decisions that had been made and the consequences that those decisions brought. Grace knew that in order to move forward, she needed to face what she had avoided for so long. She had spent years blaming herself for not doing more, for not fighting harder for her love. But now, with the letter in his hands, he understood that they had both done what they thought was best at the time, even if it meant sacrificing their own future together. Nathan's decision to walk away, to make sure she was safe and protected, was an act of love, even if it tore them apart. And Grace, in accepting this decision, had also chosen the path she believed was right. There was no going back and changing the past, but there was a way to find peace with it. Placing the letter back in her dress pocket, Grace felt a new sense of resolve rise within her. She knew that what mattered now was not what had been lost, but what she would do with the lessons she had learned. The love she shared with Nathan could never be erased, but it also didn't have to be a burden that kept her stuck in the past. Grace left the store with lighter steps, feeling that a part of her heart had finally found peace. She knew the journey wasn't over yet, but she also knew she was on the right path. And as the sun began to set, bathing the city in golden light, Grace felt that the future, for the first time in a long time, was filled with possibility. The sunrise in Atlanta was particularly beautiful that morning. The sky, tinged with soft shades of pink and orange, seemed to reflect the inner renewal Grace felt when she woke up. It was as if the universe was whispering a promise of new beginnings, something she was finally ready to embrace. After discovering the letter and confronting the secrets of her past, Grace felt different. There was something light in her heart, something she hadn't felt in many years. For so long, she had carried the weight of her choices and the consequences they brought. But now, with the truth finally revealed, that burden seemed to be lifting. As the sun rose above the horizon, Grace got out of bed with a renewed sense of purpose. She knew that the path to healing was not instantaneous, but she had already taken the first steps towards emotional freedom. And with that freedom came the responsibility to help others who, like her, might be trapped in their own secrets and fears. As Grace prepared her breakfast, she let her thoughts wander about how she could use her experiences to impact other people's lives. The pain she had felt over the years could be turned into a force for good, a way to offer hope and comfort to those who felt as lost as she had felt. Grace knew that the marks of the humiliation she suffered at the mall were still there, but now, instead of being open wounds, they were scars, reminders of what she had overcome. The public humiliation, the feeling of being judged and misunderstood had been painful, but it had also catalyzed a transformation she could never have imagined. Determined to turn this pain into something positive, Grace began making plans. She thought about organizing community meetings where people could share their stories of overcoming, offering support to each other. "I could start something small," perhaps with friends and acquaintances, but I knew that over time it could grow and help many other people find their own healing. As she organized her kitchen, Grace found herself smiling as she thought about how brighter the future now seemed. Nathan's ring was still on his finger, but now it was no longer a symbol of pain or loss. It was a reminder of the deep love they shared and the valuable lessons that love had taught him. Deciding to enjoy the new day, Grace got ready to leave. The day was bright and cool, perfect for a walk outside. She decided to go to the park where Nathan used to take her for long walks. There was something about that place that made her feel close to him, and today, more than ever, she wanted to feel that connection. In the park, while walking among the trees that swayed gently in the wind, Grace took a deep breath, feeling the peace that nature always gave her. The sound of the leaves, the singing of birds, everything seemed to conspire to bring him a feeling of calm and renewal. Sitting on a bench, Grace closed her eyes and let the memories come, not with pain, but with a feeling of gratitude. Gratitude for everything she had experienced, for the love she had experienced, and for the difficulties that, in the end, had shaped her into the woman she was today. She thought of Nathan, of his words in the letter, and felt finally at peace with the decision he had made to protect her. There were no more regrets, just acceptance and a deep respect for the sacrifice he had made. Grace knew he would always be a part of her life, but now, in a way that didn't stop her from moving forward. With a lighter heart and a clear mind, Grace began to think about the future. I knew there were still many challenges ahead, but now I felt I was ready to face them. There was so much she could do, so many lives she could touch, and it gave her a renewed sense of purpose. Upon leaving the park, Grace decided the first thing she would do was find a space where she could begin her community meetings. I wanted to create a safe place where people could come together, share their stories, and find the support they needed to overcome their own challenges. I knew this could make a big difference in many people's lives, and I was determined to make it happen. Later, upon returning home, Grace began planning the details. She knew she didn't have to do everything alone. There were people in his life who would be willing to help. She felt excited at the prospect of starting something new, something that would not only help her heal her own wounds, but also help others find healing. As day turned to night, Grace sat on her porch, watching the stars begin to shine in the dark sky. Each star seemed to symbolize a hope, a possibility, a future full of light. And for the first time in a long time, Grace felt at peace with her past and excited about the possibilities the future held. The dawn of a new day had brought more than sunlight. It had brought new hope, a new beginning. And Grace, with an open heart and a clear mind, was ready to embrace whatever the future had in store for her.